Howdy again everyone. Now, the camera I'm most familiar with in the world is probably the original Canon EOS R5, because as soon as I bought it over 4 years ago now, it immediately became my workhorse camera. Virtually all the footage you see in my reviews of products themselves are shot on it, and I've also used it to shoot a ton of 8K video projects, not to mention a few weddings, wildlife photography and other events. It's an absolutely amazing hybrid camera, so I'm excited today to be handling its successor, the new Canon EOS R5 Mark II, which is available now for $4,300 US, a $400 increase over the original, although inflation basically accounts for the difference. It's £4,500 here in the UK, but that includes VAT or sales tax. I'd like to thank Canon for loaning me this camera for a short time for evaluation, although as usual this is a totally independent review and they've had no input into it whatsoever. I'll talk a bit later about whether it might be worth upgrading to this camera or not, but for now I'll just say that it's essentially an evolutionary upgrade to the original model rather than anything totally new. It still has a 45 megapixel full frame sensor, it still offers 8K video work, except this time at up to 60 frames per second in camera in RAW, with 12-bit color depth and using the whole sensor width, which for very advanced videographers could be quite exciting. It can output ProRes RAW to Atomos external recorders also. It has in-body image stabilization and similar build quality with a very similar button layout, and its mechanical shutter can shoot at a fast 12 frames per second, and the flash sync speed is still about 1/250th of a second. It even has the same size and resolution viewfinder and screen as the original. Under the hood, as it were, though, the biggest difference in the new camera comes in the speed of its sensor. It now has a back illuminated dual pixel stacked sensor, which means we will possibly see a small improvement in high ISO image quality as well as much faster readout speeds, and that means that when shooting with the electronic shutter, you can now access a way faster burst rate of up to 30 frames per second with a blackout-free viewfinder, and you'll see lower rolling shutter when shooting video. You can now access video shooting in 8K at 60 frames per second and much lower image distortion of moving objects in your still pictures, as you can see here when you're shooting with the electronic shutter. This brings the R5 Mark II more in line with other faster sensor cameras today, like the Nikon Z6 Mark III, but it's not as fast as Nikon's Z8 or Z9 cameras, and certainly not as fast as the Sony A9 Mark III's instantaneous global shutter. Still an important improvement though. In fact, the burst rate of 30 frames per second in electronic shutter mode is so fast that you have options to slow it down a bit in the menus, and also underneath the camera's proverbial hood is an improved processor, Canon's Digic Accelerator coprocessor, the same one used in the more expensive EOS R1 camera, which crunches its way through the camera's AI processing to help improve the camera's subject detection autofocus, its exposure and white balance algorithms, as well as its other more powerful features. And I will say this, the camera's JPEG images certainly looked a little better to me in their fine details, and its white balance was excellent too. For stills photography, another new feature is AI upscaling, where the camera will try and greatly increase the resolution of an image you've already taken. As you might be able to see here, it was a little bit of a help drawing a little extra detail from your scene, but sometimes the results could look quite ugly, and certainly other reviewers have had a hit and miss experience with it. Take it or leave it, I suppose, but you'll probably get slightly better results with editing software. And for any video makers who are interested, here are the camera's overheating times for video shooting, as published by Canon themselves. The fan being referred to is an additional grip for the bottom of the camera with a built-in fan, which unfortunately costs over £500. The camera has quite a long recording limit though, 6 hours at speeds of up to 60 frames per second, 2 hours at 100 or 120 frames per second, or 45 minutes when shooting at 240 frames per second in 1080p mode. Anyway, that's a bit about the camera's upgraded speed. There are a whole host of autofocus improvements to be found also. My original R5 always did a great job with subject tracking and accuracy, although its speed and accuracy was falling behind the very latest Nikon and Sony cameras. The new sensor still houses Canon's excellent dual-pixel autofocus technology, but not in the slightly more accurate cross-type arrangement found in a much more expensive Canon EOS R1 camera. Well, Canon have to save something for their flagship, don't they? That sensor is teamed up with Canon's latest autofocus algorithms, making it just a little quicker and more accurate for subject detection autofocus, particularly sticking to human subjects better and focusing on human eyes just a little more accurately. It also features Canon's amazing action priority autofocus modes for football or soccer, basketball and volleyball, which offer amazing sport photography accuracy. Who knows, other sports might make their way in there too one day via firmware upgrades, who knows. The autofocus can also recognize and prioritize certain people in your scene, and you can even rank the priority of people registered in a camera. All pretty amazing, so I'd say the biggest upgrade in this camera is in its capability for sports photography. The camera also has a feature to help you find which images in your long bursts of shooting were actually properly in focus. Again, a huge help for sports photographers, although you need to have been shooting in electronic shutter mode and subject detection autofocus for that to work. Oh, and one more feature, up to 15 frames of pre-continuous shooting, so the camera can be set to capture up to 15 shots just before you've engaged the shutter button. So the camera is absolutely packed with Canon's top-of-the-range features here, as well as excellent quality in-body image stabilization. Let's have a look at the build quality now. The camera is fairly big and it features a tough magnesium alloy chassis, which is sealed for dust and moisture ingress. Its grip feels a bit bigger in the hands than the original. Apart from that, the only major difference in the camera's button layout is that the on-off switch has been moved to the right of the camera, which will annoy users of the original for a couple of days as they get used to it, but which I actually think works better. It's nice and quick to turn the camera on or off with your index finger now. I do wish Canon would make up their minds about where to put those on-off switches on their cameras. It seems to change all the time. Oh, and here's the controversial weatherproof guard for the hot shoe. Honestly, it's not that hard to get off. Perhaps I'm just freakishly strong or something, I don't know. The most noticeable difference you'll see will probably be the shape of that viewfinder. It's really big now in order to accommodate eye control autofocus. That's a really cool feature. I remember as a small boy, my dad taking me to an electronic show in 1993 and getting to try that very feature on the original Canon EOS 5 film camera. And as it did back then, it worked for me today just fine, although I found you certainly need to recalibrate it if you're shooting while wearing glasses. The eye control doesn't seem to work for everyone though, so you might want to try before you buy, and it's not the most useful feature in the world, honestly, although I can certainly imagine some sports photographers getting a lot out of it. The viewfinder itself has a very fast refresh rate of 120 frames per second and is very big and very high resolution. Here's the sound of the mechanical shutter in action at 12 frames per second. A little noisy, of course. Its buffer covers 670 JPEGs or 230 RAW shots with a CF Express card. When shooting with the electronic shutter at 30 frames per second, you can get 200 JPEGs into the buffer or 93 RAW images with a CF Express card. So that's a reasonably healthy buffer, although you can get even bigger. When it comes to connectivity, we get headphone and microphone 3.5mm jacks, as well as a flash port, USB-C, and finally a full-sized HDMI output. Finally, Canon have been listening to video makers. That's much more secure than a tiny HDMI port on the original R5. The camera can be connected to other devices via USB-C or with Wi-Fi 6E, for just an averagely fast wireless connection, although an optional battery grip will be available to purchase with a 2.5G base T Ethernet connection. The camera has a dual card slot, one which accepts SD cards, the other accepting CF Express Type B, which happens to be my own personal favourite combination, SD for compatibility and affordability, CF Express Type B for speed, and indeed some of the more strenuous 8K video shooting modes will only work with a very fast CF Express card. The camera comes with a new battery design from Canon, which offers a little extra power to keep this camera going. After all, it is a more powerful camera than the original R5, although battery life in my experience was very similar. There's been some slight controversy over the battery options for this camera. Third-party batteries don't seem to work for it at all, and neither do Canon's original LPE6 batteries from years ago. Only the newer LPE6NH or N batteries, or the brand new LPE6B battery. An annoyance is that these new batteries currently cost £119 each, although if you're spending £4,500 on a camera, I guess that's a relative drop in the bucket. The camera's screen is as fantastic as ever, very bright and high resolution with great touchscreen functionality and the ability to fold outwards, which is very important for video shooters. The menu layout has had a bit of a redesign to help you navigate your option sections a little easier, although in practice, like the original, it's more a question of just getting used to where everything is, as the menu is still a little labyrinthine. The camera is packed with other features too. If I covered them all, we would be here all day. Suffice to say, you are getting a ton of camera for your money here, and its features are mostly pretty useful for more strenuous shooters such as sports photographers, although wedding and video shooters will also really appreciate the camera's speed and amazing autofocus options and capabilities. Okay, well, let's take a look at image quality when shooting stills. Firstly, RAW versus JPEG. On the left we see a RAW file which is packed with detail. On the right we see the JPEG at the default level of sharpening, level 4. It's looking good enough, although the RAW image is capturing a little more detail. For anyone interested, here's an image with the JPEG sharpening down to just level 1. Adding sharpening on your computer might give you better results. I've never really been impressed with Canon's in-camera JPEG sharpening. The second thing I want to say is that the colours look gorgeous here, rich but still faithful, and the camera's auto white balance has done a very good job here too, adding just a touch of warmth maybe. Anyway, let's look at high ISO noise images now. Image noise is dealt with very well here, all the way up to ISO 1600, where just a touch of messiness in the finest details can be seen. ISO 3200 continues to look okay, but at 6400 we're starting to see a lot of smudging of fine details, and ISO 12800 is looking really quite rough, but not necessarily unusable. Oh, and for anyone else interested, here are 25,600 and 51,200, neither of which are realistically usable at all. Still, this is a great performance from that 45 megapixel Canon sensor with very good image processing, beautiful colours, low noise, and the JPEG engine's sharpening is a noticeable improvement over the original EOS R5, which I always found to offer slightly softer JPEGs. The R5 Mark II, as I mentioned, has a much faster sensor than its predecessor, and the payoff for that is often a deterioration in dynamic range. Bringing up your shadows in your RAW files shows that dynamic range is reasonably good here. Its dynamic range is a little better than Fuji's latest aps-c cameras, but those shadows are nowhere near as clean as a Leica camera or Fuji medium format. Then again, those sensors are much slower with associated disadvantages, so this is just the natural trade-off. Okay, let's see about video quality now, starting with some 8K footage, which, as you can see, is jam-packed with detail, as it was on the original R5, and noise is well under control, even up to ISO 1600. At ISO 3200, some fine noise is making itself felt, although even ISO 6400 is quite usable footage. 12,800 just looks messy, though. Still, a great performance for 8K here, just like the original R5. Alright, let's take a look at some of the 4K options. Here is the 4K fine downsampled footage, which is what I shoot with the most on my original EOS R5. Obviously it's not as detailed as 8K, but for 4K this is spectacular, and noise levels are very low here, even at ISO 1600. Even at ISO 3200 the footage is looking very good. It's only really at ISO 6400 and 12,800 that we're getting an uncomfortable level of noise. Let's have a look at the normal 4K mode then, which is still important because unlike the fine 4K footage, it doesn't cause overheating in a camera. The picture is rather softer now, and noise creeps in at lower ISOs, even showing itself at ISO 1600. ISO 3200 and beyond are quite noisy. Here's some 4K footage at 60 frames per second. Interestingly, to my eye, the footage seems marginally sharper here, but it's also even noisier than before at high ISOs. And for those interested, here's the 4K footage at 120 frames per second. We're back to seeing somewhat soft footage here, with quite a lot of noise at higher ISOs, even at ISO 1600. Here's ISO 3200 and beyond, which are looking pretty messy again. By the way, there's also a 240 frame per second mode, as I mentioned, if you're happy to shoot at 1080p. So, for amazing results in video, shoot in 8K or 4K fine modes. For slightly mediocre but still usable results, shoot in other modes or at higher frame rates. Lots of you will be interested in looking at rolling shutter. Here it is when shooting at 8K. The jelly effect is there, but it's lower than usual, thankfully, and lower than on my original R5. We see similar rolling shutter in 4K fine mode. However, in all the other 4K and 1080p shooting modes at any speed, there's very little to be seen here at all, so while it's hardly a global shutter level of performance, you're certainly getting a good showing nonetheless. Oh, and for those who like vlogging, here's some footage with a 16mm lens without any image stabilization. Here it is with the normal sensor stabilization turned on, which is helping just a little. Here it is with digital video stabilization, better, but still a little bumpy as you can see. And here we have enhanced video stabilization, again slightly better but still a little edgy really. It helps, but it's not ideal for shooting on the move. Alright then, overall, the R5 Mark II I think should be Canon's real flagship camera, as it's had so many nice little incremental upgrades over the original and even some major new features, not to mention a high resolution 45 megapixel sensor. I wasn't completely excited by its eye control autofocus feature, although it's certainly fun, but I was happy to see its mild but noticeable improvements in still JPEG image quality, extra video features, and evident improvements in autofocus, among a number of other new features. This really is one of the best cameras available today. Is it worth upgrading though if you own the original EOS R5? Well, honestly, not so much in my opinion. The improvements aren't that significant, but I do think it's well worth the upgrade if you're doing a lot of sports photography or perhaps wedding or other high pressure event photography. The much faster burst shooting and sensor readout speeds, autofocus image detection feature, anti-flicker shooting, and incredible autofocus options all really shine. I can imagine the eye control autofocus being at its most helpful in sports photography too. In fact, this camera is a truly excellent option for sports shooting. What are my criticisms? Honestly, not many here, but then again, it's a premium camera. The menu is still quite puzzling to navigate through, although you can add your own customized menu for features that you use often. I wish the camera's 4K video at 60 frames per second was sharper and not pixel binned. You can get sharper footage by shooting in 4K 60 in crop mode, but I don't want to crop it. I have to complain about the prices of its optional extras. £120 for an extra battery and £550 for a grip with a fan to reduce overheating is rather excessive, even if this is a top-of-the-line camera we're talking about. And of course, there are the issues of Canon still not allowing third-party full-frame lenses onto the EOS R system. Although at least some aps-c third-party lenses are becoming available now, I think we all wish Canon would show a bit more care for its consumers in this area. But yeah, ultimately, the EOS R5 Mark II is still one of the best cameras on the market today. Its closest competitor, I think, is the Nikon Z8, which is similarly spec'd, less expensive, and has an even faster sensor, considerably faster actually, but is bigger and heavier and doesn't feature a mechanical shutter at all, not that it really needs one in fairness. The R5 Mark II has a faster burst shooting rate for raw images, but the Z8 has a much deeper buffer to keep you going. The R5 also has slightly more advanced autofocus and a slightly longer lasting battery. They each have their own advantages. If the Canon camera is slightly more advanced and it is a year newer, then the Nikon makes up for it in its lower price. If you're into Sony, then their A7R5 is probably the closest equivalent to this. It's an older camera now, but has a high resolution sensor, albeit one that's much slower than the Canon and Nikon cameras. And the Sony A1 and A9 Mark III are way more expensive. Have fun making up your mind anyway, and of course the EOS R5 Mark II certainly comes highly recommended. Well, thanks for watching everyone. Boy, does it take a long time to test out these new cameras, but it's fun too. And if you find these videos helpful, then be sure to check out my Patreon page in the description below. There, supporters get access to all kinds of exclusive bonus content, including special monthly videos and early access to reviews. Ciao for now, and God bless everyone.